And let's go ahead and put this out there. Those t-shirts are for sale. If you would like to acquire one of our Let Me Speak to a Manager podcast t-shirts, please reach out to Frank or Ian and we will quote you a price. We do have extra.
No one's listening into this episode anyway, so this is basically just a
we got a sweet trucker hat, and the cotton is it's Egyptian cotton. I mean, Frank spent hours working on the softness of
multiple drafts.
Yes, we know you're one of our OGs if you reach out to us because you were listening this deep into this episode. Hello, loyal listeners. This episode, we are looking back at our 1-year anniversary of the Let Me Speak to a Manager podcast. Frank and I kind of go back and look at the first year, what we've done through our 60-some episodes, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what we're happy with, what our goals are for next year, and all the lessons we've learned. And when I say we've learned, pretty much I've learned since you all know that I do all the work on this thing.
You're listening to Let Me Speak to a Manager with Frank Cava and Ian Mathews.
What a crock of shit.
Yeah, that was hot mic, Sam.
You can't say God on the air.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
Frankie!
Ian, you son of a bitch.
Oh boy, you got that. Maybe button it down a little even farther. I mean, you're really straight. The Italian is popping out in you. You got that deep. That's how you get it done right there. There you go. Oh, you got one of your patented deep V's on. You should sell those on Cava Company, the deep V's. You should sell those.
This is a question I ask Ian usually when we're not recording, but Ian, do you know what rhymes with go fuck yourself? I think you will like this. I've started to watch The Sopranos. Did I ever tell you I've never watched The Sopranos?
You have told me that, and it would always piss me off. It's one of the top 5 TV shows of all time. How far are you? Are you into season 2 yet, or?
No, I'm still I'm at episode 3, but it's just, I'm a gangster movie guy. So seeing gangster movies, it's just not a gangster movie. They blew up a building and I'm I've seen better. I mean, shit, The Bronx Tale was better than that.
It gets way better in season 2. And then after season 3, it's just awesome. Because at some point you get really vested in all the characters, and there's just in the show after season 3, 4, there's always this layer of tension in The Sopranos that someone's about to get offed and you don't know who or when or what's good. There's just danger lurking around every character always. It's such a good show just for that reason alone, that you just are never sure what's going to happen.
So we're not talking about Sopranos. We're going to talk about branding and marketing and advertising today, but I will say this as well. That show has got just an amazing long tail. So many people talk about it. It still pops up in my news feeds. And it's fascinating to me. I'm a huge Mad Men fan. And in Mad Men, I don't know if you knew this, but Matthew Weiner, the writer or creator of Mad Men.
Freudian slip. Frank's thinking about wieners again.
He was, I know you didn't like that show, but he is one of the writers for the last 2 seasons of The Sopranos. He's the head writer. I don't know if you knew that. So, and the thing that's really fascinating is in episode 1, which I just watched 2 days ago, Tony Soprano goes, people can't go into a shrink, or they're going to come into a restaurant like this and stick a gun to the back of my head and shoot me. And I do know that that's how he dies in the end. So it's fascinating that they foreshadowed it in episode 1.
So Sopranos is incredible at branding. They obviously found a way to get attention, awareness. It's much easier when you have the megaphone of HBO, where people are going to watch your shows just because you have a track record. We are talking today. We are about a year into this podcast. So when this episode airs, it's going to be December. We produced our first episodes in the fall, really, of 2020, and we released them. We kind of did our big launch end of December, early January of 2021. So we've now, as of this recording, we have we have aired about 60 episodes. We have another 3 or 4 that we've recorded. We have 60 episodes that are out.
Exactly 60.
Yep. And so this episode, we're just going to kind of talk about what we've learned and really talk about what the first year was, but more important, what are we doing next? Like, what the hell is going on with us next? What are the next steps we need to take? What are the logical steps we need to take? And we're kind of airing this because Frank and I just had this discussion organically a week ago. And I think most people are like this. You get used to this in companies. As you near the end of a year, it's a very definitive date where you kind of makes you reflect on the year. New Year's always make you full of hope and make you think about different things. But they're also planning. So, Frank and I are now at a point where we're saying, okay, here's what we've done so far. What do we do for an encore? What do we do next year? What do we want it to look like in a year? Are we happy with the progress we've made? Do we want to change anything? Do we need to do anything different? So I think this episode is going to be just all about us really trying to talk it through and knowing that we don't have all of the answers either.
In December, we're doing an event called at CG called Tell Your Story or Someone Else Will. And what we're going to talk about is how important it is in our businesses, which is direct to seller sales and marketing for houses, to tell your story, because the landscape is very crowded. And it's a lot more crowded than it was when most of us started. And there's a lot of people who are bad actors, so you're going to get lumped in with them if you don't create your own story. And we're going to focus on several different people, one of which is going to kind of tell a story to kind of kick us off. One has a small team. He's in Utah, and he tells his story very differently because he's got a small team. And then we got somebody else who's got a national brand who has a mastermind where the ticket price is like $100,000 per person per year. Like, it's a big number. And his brand is quite different. So how do you advertise? How do you brand? How do you market? Becomes relevant. The other thing I was telling Ian this morning as we were prepping is I had a call yesterday about this December event, and I joined CG in 2012. Around 2014, 2015, people stopped talking just about marketing and started talking about branding. And branding and marketing are very different. And what you're going after, who you're targeting, what you're trying to accomplish, you kind of are admitting that you're no longer paycheck to paycheck when you go to a branding model. And social media is all about branding. So if you do it properly, and that's what we're going to talk about with this podcast, is how do you properly brand, get eyeballs, and get people that will be sticky with your product.
So I think we could start by just sharing with everyone what we've learned along the way of recording. So I think when if we take our first episode, we prepared a lot for it. We built an outline. It was a good episode. I think we recorded maybe 4 or 5, and then we decided which ones we were going to release right away. But I think along the way, our audio has gotten better. We bought better mics. Frank learned how to keep the microphone a little closer to his mouth and speak into it. Our lighting has gotten better. Frank has changed different places of where he's recorded. I think the office where you record matters for sound. If you're in a place that has all hardwood and high ceilings, you're going to sound like you're in an echo chamber. So a little bit smaller office with carpet is a little bit better. Studio kind of quality. I think a lot of that stuff, we've gotten just smarter about equipment, but equipment has been pretty cheap. We have a couple of microphones, and we use Zoom to record every week, but it really doesn't take much more equipment than that. That's about all we've paid for on something physical that we've purchased for this.
Yeah, and then we've upgraded our microphones. The big shift to me is the technology, right? Like, when you and I have talked to people who are like, what are you going to talk about? Like, that's pretty endless for us. We're friends. We talk anyways. We have similar things that we find interesting, or, different things pop up in the news, or we see things or articles like, okay, that's an episode. Like, creating the content for us is pretty easy. The other thing for me that I had to kind of get used to is this isn't a job interview. This is entertainment. So if it's boring, or if it's not interesting, or if it's not something that's compelling, people aren't going to listen. So you got to have some fun with it. And you have to think about anecdotes and stories and things that might be compelling. And what I thought about in becoming a podcaster is, who do I like to listen to and why? Can I emulate them in some way? Like, I'm not Michael Lewis or Malcolm Gladwell. They're much better writers than I am. I'm not Tim Ferriss. But how do they tell stories? What do they talk about? What is it there? And then when I'm left with a podcast, like, why do I think about it later? Like, what was it about that? Was it factual? Was it a fun story? Was it an anecdote? Was it something historical, something I can relate to? And those are the things you got to be comfortable with. And as you're crafting an agenda, or you're thinking about things, like what I often do is I just take notes as we're doing a podcast. As Ian says something, it strikes me, and it kind of becomes more conversational, which I think makes the podcast fun.
I think you mentioned something that's important for anyone who's thinking about doing this is, one, you've got to have somewhat of a niche. We do. Our niche is, it's all really centered around business, starting businesses, careers. We do get into investing, but it's a general business podcast, I think. We do some stuff on psychology and motivation. And I think some of that's the stuff that people like the most. But our first year was really all about testing. We didn't know how this was going to go. We didn't know how to podcast. We found a marketing firm that we send the raw video to. They helped us build our website. They turn our podcast they transcribe it. They turn it into a blog post, which is helpful in getting people to go to your website. Google uses SEO, search terms, search what kind of words do you use, put in there. So that gets more people organically coming to look at it. But we didn't really know how it was going to go. Our only real goal, and I think this is important when you're starting anything, is we didn't put too much pressure on ourselves. We didn't say, it's got to have this many views, it's got to have this many followers. We didn't do really any of that. It was more just, we're going to make 50 episodes, we're going to put them out there, and then we're going to decide, is anyone watching it? And after our 50th, we talked about it a little, and 100% people were watching it. So I think that from our standpoint, we had almost no goals. We each put about $5,000 into it at first, and that largely pays for video editing, that pays for our marketing firm that actually goes and puts this episode on Apple, on Google, on Spotify, on Stitcher, all those places, builds our blog posts. But other than that, we didn't spend a lot of money on marketing. Actually, we spent no money on marketing. About the only marketing we did was dropping little clips onto LinkedIn and Facebook. So from our standpoint, not a big investment of money, because it was a big investment of time, and for us to figure out how this fits into our work lives, because both Frank and I own multiple businesses and we're invested in multiple partnerships. So time is valuable to us, and we needed to figure out how this was going to fit in. And I think we figured that out. It's kind of, Wednesday is podcast day. Wednesday morning, usually 3.5 hours we spend together, and then the two of us go scramble and do extra stuff around it throughout the rest of the week.
What we wanted to do, our whole theme here is, will we have fun? And if we can't have fun, if we don't like doing it together, it's not going to work. And in addition to having fun, like, can we find an audience? And neither of our wives listen, and somehow we still have almost 20,000 downloads. So people are listening. Again, we're not Tim Ferriss, but we started. And what Tim Ferriss talked about, he just did an episode of how he had 770 million downloads. I listened to it twice. It's fascinating. His goal when he started was actually less daunting than ours. He wanted to start with 6 episodes. 6. That's it. Now, we had a goal of 50, but we thought we had some stuff in the can that we wanted to talk about, kind of go through. We were committed to doing it for 1 full year, because if we did 6, we probably would have quit, because we got a lot of shit going on, and we don't get the immediate impact that he had because we don't have the same name. But to that end, that's kind of where we started.
So some data. right now, as of this recording, our show has been downloaded 18,000 times. And so, one thing to kind of understand with the podcast, a typical podcast for Frank and I is an hour long. And so, a lot of the stats that you get on a podcast, they're going to be a lot lower than, say, the number of views you get on a Facebook post or a LinkedIn post. I get 18,000 views on some of the things I write on LinkedIn. But how much time does a view really cost somebody on LinkedIn? It might cost them a couple seconds. They click on it, look at it, click off, and it counts as a view. Whereas with us, to download a podcast, to click on download and listen to it, you're devoting a half an hour to just the two of us listening to us, which is really cool. And we appreciate everyone that does it. So for us, that number has been growing every month. In the last 30 days, we have 3,000 downloads. So if you were to annualize that, we'd be double what we've done so far in our first 12 months just from the last 30 days. So it has been growing. A big day for us is 250 downloads in a day. We're averaging right now probably close to 150 downloads a day. And a typical episode that we make after 30 days, and these numbers are important to advertisers, things of that such. And by no means are we even close to being able to make money on advertising yet. But a typical podcast, by the way, there are a couple million podcasts out there. So it's not like we're new to this game. Even though I still think we're early, which is crazy. I still think it's not too flooded. But typical podcast is going to get 150 downloads after 30 days. That's an average podcast. We're right now north of 300. Consistently, we're over 300 downloads on all the new ones that we go with. So that's grown. When we first started, it was closer to like 75 downloads per episode when we first started putting these things out there. So that's growing. And again, that's with $0 marketing. We're not funneling anyone here. We don't have any advertisements. And we're going to get into a little bit of that as we get through some of this, but it's that's some of the numbers right there. We're almost all of those downloads. And I wouldn't say all, but 85% are United States. Our next biggest countries that follow us, United Kingdom has downloaded this over 300 times. We're popular in the Philippines, 165, France, Singapore, India, Poland, which my wife is going to be very excited about, is in our top 10, Germany and Spain. But obviously United States that's where our money is. And 60% of our podcasts are listened to on Apple Podcasts. And I think that's a little higher than normal. Apple Podcasts is a little bit more of an affluent watcher. This is someone that has an iPhone, so it's a more expensive phone typically. And then we've got, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Chrome's 5%, people are watching. iHeartRadio is real low. That's like 2%. So we're trying to kind of figure out as a way that we market differently, be knowing that the majority of people who listen to our podcast are doing it on Apple. And the other thing also is the majority of people listening are on a mobile device.
So there's nothing like statistics being read to you over the radio that's compelling on a device.
Sexy.
Like
it's sexy.
I mean, if you haven't already tuned off, you may not have arms or hands.
Really
However, you said something in there that I did find interesting and wanted to comment on early. The National Broadcasting, NBC, not National Broadcasting Company, started on November 15th of 1926. And its most popular shows, the most popular shows on television now they're actually the ones that are most recent, but like MASH was 70 years after they launched, 60 years after they launched. Seinfeld was almost 70 years after they launched. So the point I'm getting at is many people think you're late to the podcast game. Tim Ferriss talks about this. He thinks we're still incredibly, incredibly early. Like there's tons of them. but this is an emerging market that's maybe 10, 12 years old, and it's just getting started. So there's that side of it. The other thing is, like, I hear ads on this now, like, do you want to make more money? You should start podcasting. That's horse crap. Like, it's so hard to build an audience. It's hard to produce a show, get the work done, get it out there. If you're looking to get rich quick, I don't necessarily know if a podcast is the way to do it, unless you are coming in with a huge audience already. So those are some things that I don't think Ian and I thought. We kind of thought this was you listen to our first episode, we kind of thought this was a blog that we could share with our kids at some point, right? Like, if they wanted to listen to it, they could listen to it and get to know their dads. Our friends could listen in, but we turned it into something else. But you need to know what your goals are going in. But getting rich quick is not something in the podcast space that I think is attainable.
To kill it right away in a podcast, you would have to have a big following somewhere on social media. And assuming that your big following is going to come follow your podcast is actually wrong as well. They're just not a lot like that. From platform to platform, there's not as many people as you would think that just jump and translate over. Some people just want to watch you on Facebook. Some people just want to pay attention to you on YouTube. Some people only want to follow you on Twitter. They're not necessarily, I have certain people I only follow on Twitter. I don't go to their profile and try to follow them on everywhere. That's only a few people where I kind of follow them in different places. So that's something else that we've figured out over time, because Frank and I have different audiences in different places. I think it's worth just bringing up, as we just summarize a little bit though, our top 10 episodes. So number 1 is our anatomy of a $10 million deal. And it's interesting, that is the episode we produced the most. So we had multiple cameras on us. But we also probably spent the most on getting all those clips out. It was very highly produced, so that did a little better on Facebook. I think it got shared a little more and got more people interested. What do you think, Frank?
I think it's that, and I also think it's the subject matter. Like, it's a big episode. We talk a lot about, like, a $10 million deal is a big boy deal, and we roll up our sleeves and talk about how we did it, what the process was, how much money people made. It's real. Like, it's a compelling episode.
What's interesting is that's part 2. Part 1 is nowhere in our top 20. That's hilarious. I don't know why that is, but Anatomy of a $10 million deal, only part 2 made our top 10.
Part 1, we talked a lot about concept. Part 2, we talked a lot about cash.
Execution.
So, yeah, my guess, it comes down a lot to execution. It comes down to actually making the money, which is the source where people are usually compelled.
Really interesting. I actually have to go back and listen to this episode. Our number 2 out of 60 episodes is Do You Maximize or Satisfice? Which is like a random article I read in the Harvard Business Review, sent it to Frank. He's like, that's interesting. We did some research on it. We actually put a pretty good outline together on it. But for that to be our number 2 is really surprising. I would have to go back and listen to that episode to see why. And the reason look, you get a certain number of subscribers, so you get a certain number of downloads every time. But the ones that do well, that make it into the top 10, get forwarded a lot. So somehow someone forwarded that a lot to each other. So I have to go back and even look at that.
That was a good episode. I thought that was a very interesting episode and something unique. It was also kind of early when people might have been auto downloading or whatnot.
So number 3, 5 questions to ask yourself when you're stuck, which I remember that episode. That was a fun episode.
People have told me that helped, like, because we all get stuck. We all get stuck into different things. My son's first permanent memory is most likely going to be the time I took him on the ATV in the snow. We got stuck. I ran off the side of the road. We got stuck in the mud. Literally, he still talks about it. It was a year ago. Dad, I got stuck in the mud. But getting stuck and how do you get unstuck is relevant for people who are 2 all the way through people that are 50 to 100.
Number 4, this one's interesting because Frank had to encourage me to even do it. How to use industrial property to replace your salary. I brought it up at one point and then I just put it on the back burner. It was sitting on our list. And the reason why I kind of was hesitant about even doing it is I didn't know how much it would resonate with people owning a collision center, or and the way in which I was able to do it probably excludes a lot of people. because I started by paying cash, and it ended up getting into a lot deeper interview by Frank that he did of me. But I think similar to number one, like you said, Frank, that one is a very tactical, here's exactly how I did something.
I think so. And it was, I mean, you left out the part about you got a humongous check when you quit NVR, and that's what seeded it. And that was kind of the hesitancy in doing the episode in the first place. But I think people are interested in asset class allocation and different ways to go about structuring things. And I think that's why it played so well. And then people have come up to me and said, it's really interesting hearing about it because, I'm mostly a residential guy, and this is, clearly something that's hiding in plain sight.
Number 5 is how to answer 5 of the most common job interview questions. We thought that would do great. So I don't know that just the name of that is a very sticky SEO deal. Number 6 is the art of war. And this is the first time that someone in the top 10 makes it in where we had guests. Both David Neal and Jonathan Clark of 8th Mile Consulting have nice followings online. So I think that helped this episode do well. They shared it a lot on their socials. So a learning from us there is it does work when you add a guest who has some bit of a following that they're going to share it as well.
Yep. That was fun. We did it at 6 o'clock in the morning because it's 7 o'clock at night there before the time change. And I don't know, these maniacs wanted a drink. So I literally worked out with my trainer at 5, was at my desk with a Grolsch and a protein shake at 6.
Fantastic.
Then Max came downstairs at 7:30 and the episode ended.
That's right. Number 7 is loyalty hurting your career. That one we just talk about how so many people are misguided about the concept of loyalty and how long they should stay with a company and assume that companies are going to replicate that loyalty.
Yeah. We're living through, there's been all the great things in our lives, right? There's like Watergate, and then there's, Monica Gate. And so it's gone from like Gates to the Great. There was like the Great Recession, and now they call it the Great Resignation. So I feel like that's relevant in today's environment because after COVID, when everyone thought they were going to go broke and just worked 100 hours a day until it was no longer sustainable, people have now prioritized me, myself, my health, and my well-being, and that includes where I live and how I conduct myself. And I think loyalty plays a big part in that, and people I think are shifting towards being loyal to themselves. That's one of the big takeaways from the pandemic.
Number 8 is, are you self-handicapping, which is a psychological term where people say things that they don't really mean, like money is the root of all evil, or if they're about to do a big race, they'll say, I stayed up all night, and I didn't get enough sleep. So it's kind of making excuses before you even try, which ends up leaning into you losing. I think that resonated with people. Number 9, pretty obvious one, how to ask your manager for a pay raise. We get into nuts and bolts in that episode, which doesn't surprise me at all that one got forwarded around a lot, because we are very specific on the right scripts, what to say, what not to say. If you're going to ask for more money, here's exactly how you need to do it. And then number 10 is, do you want to stick it to your former employer? So we use Tom Brady as an example in that episode of someone who went to a different company and went back to play his former company and how much he must have wanted to win. So those
he did.
Those are our top episodes. Anything terribly surprising in those 10 that made it in there?
Not really. I mean, that's kind of the best. I'm kind of surprised fantasy football didn't do better. But that makes sense. I mean, the things with big names like Shaquille, when we put out the Gary V one, probably get some pretty good pops at some point, but those guys are all over the internet.
Yeah. So, and also some of the ones that we did recently, some of those that are in there, they've had 12 months for people to scroll back. So what happens is you get a new listener and they like an episode, then they listen to the last episode. And then what they'll do is they'll scroll down until they find an episode that seems interesting. So you get pops every once in a while of stuff that we released in February or March, and it'll get like 50 downloads in a week. And you'll say, where did that come from? And it's just probably new listeners that have scrolled back through your catalog and go back and start listening to a bunch of them, which is what I do with podcasts. when I find a new one.
One of the things that I do think that was smart is we ended up releasing like our 10th episode first. And by the time we released our first one, we had a little bit of momentum, because our first one, it's kind of awkward when you first get started. I mean, we used to take breaks, and there was like all kinds of stuff that we like kind of worked around. The audio was broken in a couple of instances. Ian's dog jumped on a computer and shut off the recording in one. I mean, if there's a problem, we've encountered it.
We weren't the well-oiled machine that we are, that you hear today, the well-produced, highly produced machine we are today. So really what the challenge is, Frank, so we started something, and there's a lot of people have ideas. A lot of people say, I want to do a podcast. A lot of people say, I want to start a business. How many people do you know, Frank, that someone started a business and they said, I had that idea? And it's like, well, okay, good job. You had an idea and you didn't do anything about it. Execution is the hard part. So the hard part for most people in starting a podcast is coming up with enough content. Frank and I know the content we want to talk about. It's not for everyone. Some people like it, some don't. We'll never run out of material to talk about every week. We have a backlog of 10 ideas right now that we just need to put outlines together on. That's
so I find it funny when people are like, oh, I can do that. I have an idea, etc. So I called Ian. My son was born at the end of October of 2018. I remember calling Ian. It's like 2-3 days old. And we were talking. I'm like, I'm not really tired yet. This morning, I was looking at my wife. We both slept for over 8 hours last night. We've got a 3.5-year-old and an 8-month-old, and she just yawned like out of nowhere. And I kind of equate this to that. Like, yeah, no shit, you're not tired with a 3-day-old. You're on emotion and adrenaline. You got a 3.5-year-old and a 1-year-old. You're keeping 2 kids alive. You're dealing with temper tantrums and yogurt on your nicest painting. And when they go to bed, you're dealing with like just being tired and just grinded down. You got to go make lunch or put a bottle together. And I don't do most of this. My wife does almost all of it. But the point I'm getting at is that's when tired sets in with parenting. It's like when kids are like, you got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. It's a slog. And that's what podcasting is. Podcasting is not show up once, do it once, and congratulations. Like the really, really well-produced Malcolm Gladwell's of the world, who I really like a lot of his stuff. He does a season with 12 episodes, and he's got a staff of like 40 people. And what Ian and I are doing is we've got more budget than most people, but we come up with a topic, things we are interested in, things that keep us moving and kind of or is a narrative of what we're thinking about or living through. And we talk about it and we memorialize it. And that's kind of fun for us. And what we're getting into now is, because we're businessmen, do we want to make this a business? Do we want to continue to keep this as a hobby that's a great tax write-off because we're just spending money? Or do we want to turn it into something because we think there's something here? Now, we're self-confident enough to think that this is actually pretty good. We've gotten enough feedback that tells us that these conversations are like being in the back office with 2 executives who kind of chop things up and talk real about business items. So then it comes down to marketing. Like, do we want to continue to have Ian do the clips and then bitch at me that I don't do enough work? Is that what's important? Or do we want to grow? Do we want to skip that staff? Do we want to put things in front of it? In the episode we did where Ian went and saw Gary Vee, I think he mentioned it in the recording, like Gary Vee like changed outfits 3 times while Ian was with him for 2 hours. Like, because Gary Vee is highly produced. He's a commodity. And he's doing things with incredible intentionality. And what we started off as is kind of just a hobby to see if it works. If it's going to become something that people know about, and we start getting in, we're in the 92nd percentile right now on downloads. If we get into the 95th percentile or the 99th percentile, it's going to be because we took extremely precise and consistent action like we do in everything else in our business.
So I think something you just said is important. So maybe we're in the top 10 or 15% right now of downloads of episodes, but the only people making money are in the top 1%, top 1. And the jump from saying I'm a top 15, top 10% podcast to I'm a top 1, it's logarithmic. It is straight. It's like a hockey stick to get there. You're adding a couple of zeros per episode to talk about, how to grow it. So for us, okay, we went from 75 to 150 to 300. We've got some 500, 600, 700 download episodes after 30 days, which is the metric that matters. How do we get to 7,000, 17,000, 70,000 downloads? Those kind of questions. And I think if you're doing anything, one, you got to start with like, what's our aspirations? What are our aspirations?
And let's answer that. Our aspiration, Tim Ferriss was 6 episodes. Ours is get a year. We got a year in. We got t-shirts, we got hats, we've had some fun. And I think what we see is, okay, we've got momentum. And as you said earlier, it's a year in, let's reassess.
And let's go ahead and put this out there. Those t-shirts are for sale. If you would like to acquire one of our Let Me Speak to a Manager podcast t-shirts, please reach out to Frank or Ian and we will quote you a price. We do have extra.
No one's listening to this episode anyway, so this is basically just
we got a sweet trucker hat, and the cotton it's Egyptian cotton. I mean, Frank spent hours working on the softness of
multiple drafts.
Yes, we know you're one of our OGs if you reach out to us because you were listening this deep into this episode. So the question is, what's our aspiration for what's next? And I think that's anything you're doing, any business you're starting, you have to lay out, what do we want to be? So if we're doing this episode again in December of next year, where do we want to be? How many downloads? How much bigger do we want to be? I'm to the point where I think we know how to make this content. We need to spend some money on marketing. We spent none. And when we went through this last week, Frank and I were kind of getting frustrated with ourselves of like, how does this get a little bigger? What do we got to do? And we don't even have an Instagram page. We didn't have a TikTok page. We do almost nothing on Facebook. I don't think we have a Facebook page for just this podcast. Everything Frank and I was doing was just kind of off of our individual. So since then, we created a TikTok page. We created a Instagram page. Now the question is, so 60 some episodes, we have 600-700 1 to 2 minute clips of us talking about various things, from anything from investing to starting a company to real estate to clowning around, whatever, marketing, sales, psychology. So we could post 4, 5, 6 1-minute clips a day on all social media, on our branded Let Me Speak to a Manager podcast social media sites, and not run out for the next year and a half. And that's without us creating new stuff all the time. So what Frank and I are now looking at is, who's going to do that for us, right? Do we hire someone part-time? It's not a full-time job probably, but can you get someone part-time that's just posting that kind of knows our voice? Is it someone on Frank's team that's kind of working with me on some of the things that I'm doing? How do we get the word out? And then what are we spending? So one, do you have social media sites? Are you posting? That'll cost some money to just get someone to post to it. But the other big thing is, what are you doing about actual ad spending?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there's anything to add there. It's intentionality. We got to pick and choose. Are we going to do this or not? And are we going to put staff behind it? And one of the things that we've talked about, we've never done the episode, but it's something we've talked about is, when do you hire your first employee? So for me, it's always been kind of a barometer of, I hire an employee when you need to be able to afford it, which Ian and I are in a position where we can. That's one. But two, like, is there things that will grow the business that I don't enjoy doing, or I don't look forward to doing, or I don't want to do anymore? And that's part of it. Like, Ian wanted to be very, very, very hands-on with the clips and the posting. And I knew from jump that I don't have the time to, nor the inclination to do it. He's better at the writing. So now it's time to look at it and say, okay, what can we both do? And how do we structure that? And I think that transcends across every single business you could ever be in.
I think that's right. And I think you're not serious about a business until you consider bringing an employee on. It doesn't mean you have to, but when you get to a place where I got to probably bring an employee on, you're really serious about getting involved in the business, because now you are bringing someone else with you who trusts their livelihood with you. But also, I love what Frank said. If you want to decide what to give your first employee, give them all the things you hate about the business, because and normally there's more of that than the strategic stuff. And if you hate a lot of the things of the business, you won't grow it. You'll want to quit it. You'll want it to stop and not do it anymore.
So if you are contemplating outsourcing your camera time and being in front of a microphone on a podcast, you shouldn't be in podcasting. Like you shouldn't be in podcasting at all. Get out. But if you're wanting to outsource some of the other things, the advertising, you could be in the right medium. You're just doing the wrong things. And that's where you have to refocus.
Yeah, I think that's right. So for us, we have to figure out a budget. So, we're kind of thinking about it where how much do we spend on advertising a month? We've kind of landed on, we'd be good with $1,000 each putting it in. Okay. Well, we have our marketing firm that we have to spend. So what's that number going to come down to between the two of us putting into this podcast, marketing it, trying to grow it? That number could come out to a combined $30,000, $40,000 next year that we spend on growing this. Is that going to get a return? No, there's zero chance that gets any return in 2022. So again, I think it comes down to what's a brand worth for you? What ultimately the end goal, Frank, if we are getting 70,000 downloads an episode, there's advertising you can charge. There's, you can make money just from people wanting to put ads on your site. But I think bigger picture, Frank and I have multiple businesses that we do, some together, some not together, where this podcast would act as marketing for other businesses. So Frank has Cava coaching. Frank and I both raise money for real estate deals. I can tell you already, we've had multiple investors in both real estate deals and my tech company that have heard about those things from this podcast. I have several consulting deals that I've done with large businesses that I am now teaching their managers my leadership essentials class. And the decision makers were followers of our podcast. So to me, that's, if someone listens to a podcast, that's like an hour-long sales call I get without putting the time in. So the more that spreads, the more our other businesses can flourish, and the marketing, that money of us growing that brand, how many people are going to get into our other programs and businesses?
Right. And so I talked earlier about this, and Ian and I were talking about this. I kind of want to work this in, but there's a difference between advertising and branding. And this has been a little bit of an advertisement. We recorded the Westwood Holdings deal where he raised a $4.5 million bond. And then we ultimately got that recording and sent it to our investors and said, listen to this. The deal's a little different. Read the prospectus as well. But this was an overview of it. And we didn't necessarily record it thinking it would be that, but it was. But that's a sales tool. But this is mostly a branding tool. It's up on our social media sites. It goes all over the place. People were like, oh, wow. I didn't know you did this. I didn't know Ian had an ability to do that. I didn't know you guys were diverse like this. So it becomes something different than just straight advertising. And I think the easiest thing you can look at is like, what is branding, right? Like Coca-Cola has been sponsoring the Olympics since 1928. 1928. They're signed on through 2032. So it's a 104-year run. And I'm sure they're going to keep doing it. In the 2016 Rio Games, they had 500 million social media impressions. That cost them $3 billion. $3 billion. But what does 500 million impressions turn into? I don't know. But that's why branding is important. Branding, like Coca-Cola and Let Me Speak to a Manager, are on the opposite ends of the branding spectrum, allow me to assure you. But the case is, it is a branding tool for us. You know what else is a branding tool that all of us see and use? LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter. That's what it is. It's direct to consumer. Have you ever noticed now, like when you read an article, they quote the Twitter article, and then the Twitter article is actually in the article? It's like ridiculous. Like, I just put it there once and you see it twice, but that's it, because consumers can now control their narrative. An athlete can control their narrative. They don't have to go to a reporter. And if you want this to be a branding tool for you, it can be.
It's a little embarrassing. So we had the Gary V episode where we talked about some of the advice he gave, but it's Wednesday. On Monday, I created a TikTok site for Frank and I, right? And I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I'm terrible at it. Frank didn't even know I did it until a day later because I just played with a little bit, but I got all these little clips. So I just started posting little clips of us, and it's like 36 hours later, and we've got a couple hundred followers on TikTok, which is a lot more than the 50 followers we have on YouTube, where we've had a site for a year. We've got all kinds of shares, all kinds of comments, likes. So it's like, this is embarrassing. We've only put 9 episodes up, and we have 600 little clips we could put on TikTok. And we've already got this kind of like, we should have been doing this months ago. I'm not going to beat ourselves up. We don't have the time to do it months ago, but that's where I look at it. I'm like, for me, marketing and branding, all of it, you have to test. We've been testing on LinkedIn. We kind of know what works there. We've been testing on Facebook. We haven't tested Instagram. We haven't tested TikTok. But TikTok, we've got a lot of eyeballs, and I don't know how much those will translate. I think we'll have to figure that out at some point. But we know what advertising does over there. And that might be a place where we go heavy versus the other places because we've tested it and it's resonating.
So we got 2 minutes left in this episode, and it's going to come to a close. This will be my last salvo in this episode. If you're going to get into podcasting, get into it. Do it. It's a long-term type of a thing. You can always quit, but you can start, and if you want to, commit to it. In addition to that, what Ian just talked about, marketing, branding, advertising, those types of things, you need to do some of it yourself, at least some of it. Ian built our clips at first because he said he had the time and he's good at it, and he wanted to edit it and put out a certain message because he wrote most of the copy. We have not done shit with our YouTube channel. We don't. It's pretty evident. We like, you can't even find it. But these are the little things that you start to look at.
We don't even know our login. So this is what's embarrassing. Frank's trying to get someone to help us, and we can't tell him our login or password. Right. Because we don't know who created it for us.
Well, the most important thing, it doesn't matter because it's not in alignment with what we set out to do at first. At first, it was just get 50 episodes. We did it. Now we can start worrying about other things like putting out the next 50, but actually finding people who will listen to it. And that's the next step. But that's how everything in life works. You got to cross the first hurdle before you can get to the second one. And then the cool thing about podcasting is you get to set the hurdles. And that's what we have liked and learned through this process.
Yep. And it's, I love what you just said. You take one step at a time. The first step is let's figure out what our show should be. Let's create content. The next step for us, which is any business really, any business is create a product, create a service, then find the customers, then grow awareness. We're in awareness mode. So now it's on us to go figure out how do we build the brand. And we do that through social media, through advertising, through marketing. That's our next big step in 2022.
So if you've listened to this episode, you've done so before we spend a nickel in marketing. And that means somehow or another, you found us, you like us, and you listen to us. And for that, all we can say is thank you.
We like you. Even the ugly followers, we like you too.
Goodbye, Ian.
See you, Frank.
See you, pal.